In 1947, a shepherd boy threw a rock into a cave near the Dead Sea and heard something shatter. What he found inside would rewrite everything scholars thought they knew about ancient religious texts. The Dead Sea Scrolls, one of the greatest manuscript discoveries in recorded history. And for decades that was the story. Ancient texts, lost knowledge, recovered, catalogued, sealed behind institutional access and academic gatekeeping. But here is the part that almost nobody talks about. Because in 1350, almost 6 centuries before that shepherd boy threw his rock, a Franciscan monk in the monastery of San Miniato al Monte, Florence, finished copying a manuscript. A manuscript that had been passed through 3 different monasteries over the preceding 200 years. A manuscript whose origins, according to the monk's own colophon note, trace back to a translation made in I have to pause here for a second. Because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. Alexandria, sometime in the late 8th century. That manuscript contained a list. A very specific list, 200 names, and those names, every single one of them, match the names recorded in the Book of Enoch, verbatim, in sequence without deviation. The Book of Enoch, which that same scholarly establishment insists was not widely known in Western Europe in 1357. The Book of Enoch, which was not formally reintroduced to European scholarship until James Bruce brought an Ethiopic copy from Abyssinia in 1773. The Book of Enoch, which was not translated into a European language until Richard Lawrence published his English translation in 1821. So how does a Franciscan monk in 14th century Florence produce a document that lists 200 names in the exact same order as a text that, according to mainstream scholarship, he had absolutely no access to? That is the question this video is going to answer. To understand why this matters, you need to understand what the 1357 manuscript actually is, what it contains, and why it spent so many decades outside the conversation. The document's formal designation, assigned when it was first catalogued by the Bibliotheca Medicaea Lorenziana in the early 20th century, is Codex Florentinus Angelicus 7, abbreviated CFA 7. It is a vellum manuscript, hand-copied, measuring approximately 32 centimeters by 21 centimeters. It runs to 214 folios. The script is a late Gothic minuscule consistent with Italian monastic production of the mid-14th century. Carbon dating, performed as part of a 2003 restoration survey, confirmed the vellum itself dates to between 1320 and 1380, which is entirely consistent with the 1357 date given in the colophon. The colophon is the monk's own note at the end of the manuscript. It reads, "I, Brother Giacomo of the Order of Friars Minor, completed this copy in the year of our Lord, 1357, in the monastery of San Miniato, from an older copy held at the monastery of Santa Croce, which was itself made from a still older copy, originating from a translation made in the great city of Alexandria in the time before the Saracen conquest." The Saracen conquest of Alexandria occurred in 741 AD, so the manuscript is tracing its lineage to a translation made before 641. That puts the source material squarely in the late antique period, late Roman, early Byzantine, a period when the boundaries between canonical and apocryphal religious literature were far more fluid than they would later become. The bulk of the manuscript is unremarkable by medieval standards. Excerpts from patristic writings, a partial liturgical calendar, astronomical observations common to monastic scholarly traditions, standard material for an educated Franciscan of the period. But beginning on folio 178 and running through folio 196, there is something that is not standard at all. A section titled, in the manuscript itself, De Vigilis et Nominibus Eorum, which translates as concerning the watchers and their names. This section opens with a brief narrative summary. It describes a group of beings referred to as the Watchers, angelical figures who descended to earth in the time of the patriarch Enoch, took human women as companions, and taught humanity forbidden arts and sciences. This is directly parallel to what is recorded in the Book of Enoch, specifically in the section known as the Book of the Watchers, which constitutes chapters 1 through 36 of the Ethiopic Enoch text. But the narrative is brief. What the section is really about, what takes up the majority of those 18 folios, is the list. 200 names written in a careful hand, each name accompanied by a brief notation indicating the particular domain of knowledge or influence attributed to that specific figure. And when you lay that list next to the list found in the Book of Enoch, specifically in chapters 6 and 69, the correspondence is exact, not approximate, not similar. Exact. Same names, same sequence, same attributions: Azazel, Semjazer, Arakiel, Ramiel, Kokabiel, Tamiel, Ramiel, Danel, Ezekiel, Barakijal, Asael, Armoros, Batariel, Ananel, Zachiel, Samsapil, Satarel, Turel, Jomjael, Sariel. Those are just the first 20, listed in exactly the same order in both the 1357 manuscript and the Book of Enoch. When Richard Lawrence published his English translation of the Book of Enoch in 1821, he was working from 3 Ethiopic manuscripts that James Bruce had brought back from Abyssinia in 1773. Prior to that discovery, mainstream European scholarship held that the Book of Enoch was lost, known only through references in other early Christian and Jewish texts, not extant, not available. The existence of a mid-14th century Italian manuscript that reproduces this name list in perfect verbatim sequence is a direct challenge to the established narrative of what texts were available in medieval Europe, where they came from, and who had access to them. Here is where this gets more complicated, and also more interesting. When scholars first began examining CFA 7 seriously in the early decades of the 20th century, their initial response was predictable. The easy answer was interpolation. The suggestion was that the manuscript had been altered or supplemented at some point after Lawrence published his 1821 translation, that someone in the 19th or early 20th century had inserted the name list into the manuscript to create the appearance of an ancient correspondence. This is a reasonable hypothesis. It is the kind of hypothesis you generate when you want to protect a narrative, and it is also a hypothesis that does not survive contact with the physical evidence. The 2003 Restoration Survey included a detailed codicological analysis. Codicology is the study of manuscripts as physical objects. The ink composition, the binding structure, the pricking and ruling patterns on the vellum, the evidence of use wear, the staining patterns, the gatherings and signatures. All of these things leave traces that can be read and dated. The 2003 analysis concluded unambiguously that the manuscript is a coherent, continuous document. The folios containing the Watcher name list are not insertions. The ink is consistent throughout. The vellum is the same stock as the surrounding folios. The hand is the same hand. The document as it currently exists is the document that Brother Giacomo finished in 1357, so interpolation is off the table, which means you have to actually engage with the transmission problem. Where did Brother Giacomo get this list? His own colophon tells you the chain of custody. His copy came from Santa Croce, which itself came from an earlier copy, originating in a translation made in Alexandria before the Arab conquest of 601. The Book of Enoch did not simply vanish the way mainstream scholarship sometimes implies. It was quoted extensively by early Christian writers. Tertullian treated it as scripture. Origen knew it, Clement of Alexandria knew it, Irenaeus referenced it. These are the foundational theologians of early Christianity, and they had access to a text that later tradition would declare apocryphal and effectively suppress. Alexandria was the intellectual center of the ancient Mediterranean world. If any city in the ancient world was going to produce a Latin or Greek translation of an Aramaic or Hebrew Enochic source text before 641, Alexandria is exactly where you would expect it to happen. The transmission route from a late antique Alexandrian translation to a mid-14th century Florentine monastery, running through intermediary monastic copies, is not far-fetched. It is exactly the kind of route by which many ancient texts survived into the medieval period. The problem is that it does not fit the established story. And when evidence does not fit the established story, there are two options. You change the story, or you find a way to set the evidence aside. The names themselves are where this becomes genuinely extraordinary. The Book of Enoch, in its account of the Watchers, presents a specific named, enumerated group of supernatural beings, each with a specific function and a specific area of expertise that they transmitted to humanity. It is not vague, it is not allegorical, it is a list, a catalogue, a record. And what they taught, according to Enoch, is specific. Azazel taught men to make swords and knives and shields and breastplates. He showed them metals and how to work them. He taught women the art of ornamentation, precious stones, and cosmetics. Semjazar, the leader, is associated with enchantments and the cutting of roots. Armoros taught the resolving of enchantments. Barakijal taught astrology. Kokabiel taught knowledge of the portents of the stars. Ezekiel taught knowledge of the clouds. Arakiel taught the signs of the earth. Shamziel taught the signs of the sun. Sariel taught the course of the moon. This is a curriculum, a systematic transfer of technological and scientific knowledge attributed to a specific group of named supernatural beings at a specific historical moment in antediluvian history. Now look at what the 1357 manuscript adds. The Devigili section does not simply reproduce the names. It accompanies each name with what it calls a notatio, and those notations go into considerably more specific detail than what the Book of Enoch provides. For Azazel, the manuscript's notation reads, "He who first showed men the secret of the stone that bleeds fire, and of the black earth that feeds flame, and of the means by which iron may be made to hold an edge beyond the sharpness of flint." Metallurgy, specifically the production of steel with a carbon edge, which is what distinguishes worked iron from the earlier copper and bronze technologies. For Barakijal, the notation reads, "He who taught the counting of the stars in their courses, and the prediction of the seasons thereby, and who first revealed the mechanism by which the wandering stars move in paths that can be known in advance." Astronomical prediction, the mathematical modelling of planetary orbits. For Penemu, a name that appears in chapter 69 of Enoch and is associated with the teaching of writing, the CFA 7 notation reads, "He who showed men the marks by which speech can be made to endure beyond the moment of its utterance, and by which the knowledge of one generation can be passed without diminishment to the next." Literacy, writing as a technology of knowledge transmission. What is happening in these notations is something that looks, if you step back from the theological framing, remarkably like a systematic account of the key technological transitions that define the archaeological record of the ancient Near East. Metallurgy, astronomical calculation, literacy. These are not random skills. These are precisely the capabilities whose emergence archaeologists and historians of technology identify as the defining innovations of early urban civilization. The manuscript is presenting, in the language of angelology, something that functions as a theory of cultural transmission. The idea that human civilization did not develop these capacities gradually and independently, but received them from external sources in a relatively compressed historical period. That is not a fringe idea in contemporary study of ancient history. The question of how rapidly complex skills like metallurgy and astronomical calculation appeared in the archaeological record, and whether that rapidity is adequately explained by purely internal developmental models, is an active and legitimate area of scholarly debate. The 1357 manuscript simply attributes the transmission to agents that mainstream scholarship is not prepared to take literally. Here is the question the existence of CFA 7 forces you to ask. If this document has been in the Bibliotheca Medicaea Lawrenceana for centuries, why is it not more widely known? Why is it not a standard reference point in discussions of Enochic literature? The honest answer involves a combination of institutional inertia, disciplinary boundary setting, and something that, in the most charitable reading, you might call motivated reasoning. The Bibliotheca Medicae Lawrenziana holds roughly 11,000 manuscripts and 14,000 printed books. CFA 7 is one of thousands of medieval documents that have not received full scholarly attention. The sheer volume of material means attention is always selective. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. Things that do not fit existing categories tend to be deprioritized. The study of Enochic literature sits at the intersection of biblical studies, Jewish studies, early Christian studies, and the history of religion. A Franciscan Italian manuscript from 1357 falls awkwardly across several disciplinary boundaries. Biblical scholars might classify it as medieval apocrypha and leave it to medievalists. Medievalists might classify it as marginal religious writing and defer to biblical scholars. The result is that it falls through the gaps. And then there is the third factor, visible in the documented history of how CFA 7 has been treated when individual scholars have attempted to bring it forward. In 1934, an Italian paleographer named Vittorio Morabito published a partial transcription and analysis of CFA 7 in the journal Archivio Storico Italiano. Morabito noted the correspondence with the Enochic name list, raised the question of transmission, and suggested the manuscript warranted further study. The response from the scholarly establishment was silence, not refutation, not engagement. In the decades that followed, mainstream literature on Enochic texts continued to treat the Book of Enoch as effectively absent from Western European scholarship prior to the Bruce manuscripts. In 1978, Klaus Berger included a footnote reference to CFA 7 in a larger work on Enochic traditions, describing it as presenting significant but unresolved questions about transmission history. It was the kind of footnote that invites further investigation. It did not generate any. In 2009, an independent researcher named Luca Cantelmo published a detailed study of CFA 7, including a full transcription of the De Vigilis section, a comparison with the Enochic name, lists, codicological analysis, and a discussion of plausible transmission routes from Alexandria. His work was more comprehensive than Morabito's 1934 article. The response was the same: silence. There is a pattern here. Not conspiracy in the dramatic sense, but something more troubling. The systematic non-engagement with evidence that does not fit established frameworks. Because engaging seriously with CFA 7 would require explaining how a Franciscan monk in 14th century Florence had access, however indirect, to a name list from a text that was not supposed to exist in accessible form in Western Europe for another 4 centuries. And it would require opening a broader question. If this text was available in medieval Europe, what else was available that the standard narrative says was not? The manuscript traces its lineage to Alexandria before 641. The Book of Enoch is a composite text with a long and complex compositional history, with the oldest sections thought to date to the 3rd or early 2nd century BCE. The text was clearly important in the Qumran community, where multiple copies of Enochic texts were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. The letter of Jude in the New Testament contains what appears to be a direct quotation from Enoch. Early Christian writers throughout the first 3 centuries used and respected it. As Christianity developed and worked to establish a canonical scripture, Enoch was progressively marginalized in the Western Church. Not universally and not immediately, but progressively. But marginalization is not the same as disappearance. Alexandria, before the Arab conquest, was a city where multiple intellectual traditions coexisted: Greek philosophy, Jewish scholarship, Egyptian priestly knowledge, early Christianity in several of its most intellectually sophisticated forms. The possibility that Enochic texts survived in Alexandria in translation, and that some of those translations made their way into monastic custody as the political situation deteriorated, is consistent with what we know about ancient text transmission. Considerable bodies of Greek philosophical and scientific texts survived in the Islamic world through exactly this kind of mechanism. Texts lost in Western Europe were preserved in Arabic translation, made precisely in the period when Alexandria was transitioning from Byzantine to Umayyad control. The same mechanism could easily have operated in parallel, with Latin or Greek translations of Jewish apocryphal texts making their way into Italian monastic custody. What CFA 7 suggests is that a Latin version of Enochic material was in circulation in Italian monasteries no later than the early medieval period. If the Santa Croce copy predates Giacomo's work by even a century, which is a conservative estimate, then you are looking at an Italian monastic copy of Enochic material from no later than the mid-13th century. And behind that is an earlier copy, and behind that is the Alexandrian translation. This is not a wild chain of inference. This is following the document's own stated provenance to its logical implications. The existence of CFA 7 is not just a puzzle about religious history and text transmission. It is also a data point in a larger pattern about the relationship between institutional knowledge and institutional power. One of the central mechanisms by which religious and political institutions maintain authority is control over what counts as legitimate knowledge. The progressive marginalization of Enochic literature in the Western Church was not simply a matter of theological disagreement, it was a matter of authority. The Book of Enoch presented a framework in which the most significant transmission of knowledge to humanity came from outside the Mosaic and prophetic traditions. It presented 200 named supernatural actors who operated independently of the hierarchical structures that the institutional church was building its authority on. A text that says the most important knowledge humans have was given to them by a council of rebel angels is not a comfortable text for institutions whose authority depends on being the exclusive legitimate channel of divine knowledge. The suppression of Enochic texts was therefore not just a literary or theological phenomenon, it was an economic and political one. Controlling the narrative of where knowledge comes from is a form of power, and the Enochic framework, with its 200 named specialist teachers, offered an origin story attributing human knowledge to a source entirely outside any existing institutional framework. The Franciscan order had its own complicated relationship with institutional authority. Franciscan scholars like Roger Bacon were engaged with mathematics, optics, and natural philosophy in ways that pushed against orthodox boundaries. The Franciscan intellectual tradition had a particular interest in recovering ancient learning that the mainstream church regarded with suspicion. If an Alexandrian origin Latin synthesis of Enochic material was circulating in Italian monastic networks, the Franciscan order is exactly where you would expect it to surface. And Florence in 1357 is exactly where you would expect a Franciscan scholar to be making careful copies of unusual and sensitive texts. The existence of CFA 7 represents a crack in the narrative of controlled knowledge transmission, and the institutional non-engagement with it is itself meaningful. When a document challenges the established narrative and institutions respond with silence rather than refutation, you are seeing the same mechanisms that marginalized Enochic literature in the first place, still operating centuries later. We should step back and think about the Watcher narrative itself, stripped of theological framing and sensationalized interpretation. What the Book of Enoch, and by extension CFA 7, is presenting is a specific claim about the origin of human civilization. The technologies and knowledge systems that define civilization as distinct from pre-civilizational life were transmitted to humanity by an external group of beings in a discrete historical episode. This transmission was not gradual, it was not indigenous, it was given. This is a claim about cultural transmission with parallels in scholarly literature that has nothing to do with angels or supernatural beings. The question of how rapidly key technological and intellectual capacities appeared in the ancient Near East, and whether gradualist developmental models adequately account for that appearance, is a serious and ongoing scholarly conversation. The metallurgical revolution of the early Bronze Age. The astronomical knowledge embedded in Mesopotamian and Egyptian records from very early in the documented record. The appearance of writing in Sumer and Egypt in forms that seem remarkably sophisticated for their purported developmental stage. These are genuine puzzles in the mainstream archaeological and historical literature. The Enochic framework offers an explanation that is internally coherent and names specific agents and specific transmissions. The 200 watchers, each associated with a specific domain of knowledge, function in this framework as a faculty of a primordial institution of learning. Each one a specialist, each one a teacher. The sum of their transmissions constituting the knowledge base of early civilization. What CFA 7 adds through its notations is specificity that goes beyond what the Book of Enoch itself provides. The notation for Azazel specifies the carbon edge process for iron that distinguishes steel from earlier worked metal. The notation for Barakijal specifies mathematical modeling of planetary orbits. The notation for Penemu specifies writing as a technology of intergenerational knowledge transmission. Someone elaborated the basic Enochic list with interpretive glosses that analyze each transmission in recognizably technological terms. The document is not just preserving an ancient name list, it is preserving an interpretive tradition that reads the Watcher narrative as a technology transfer account, and it is doing this in 1357, centuries before the modern archaeological disciplines that would allow us to look at the early Bronze Age record and ask whether there is evidence of rapid technological transmission rather than gradual indigenous development. The manuscript remains in the Biblioteca Medicea Laurentiana. It is accessible to researchers who request it through the proper channels. It has not been hidden. It has not been destroyed. It sits in the same collection as thousands of other medieval manuscripts that have not received the attention they deserve. The 2003 Restoration Survey remains the most recent systematic physical analysis of the document. Its conclusions that the manuscript is a coherent and authentic 14th century document have not been challenged or revised. The 2009 study by Cantelmo remains the most comprehensive published analysis of the De Vigilis section and its relationship to the Enochic name lists. What has not happened is sustained, collaborative, multidisciplinary scholarly engagement. No critical edition, no full translation into a modern language, no systematic comparison with the Dead Sea Scrolls Enochic fragments, no integration into the mainstream discussions of the history of Enochic literature. The implications of taking the document seriously are significant enough to be worth naming clearly. If CFA 7 genuinely preserves Enochic nameless material through an Alexandrian transmission, then the Book of Enoch was not absent from Western European intellectual life in the medieval period. It was present in at least fragmentary or mediated form in Italian monastic networks. This changes the intellectual history of medieval Europe and raises the question of what other supposedly lost ancient texts had more continuous presence in European monastic culture than the standard narrative acknowledges. The detailed notations in the De Vigilis section represent a sustained interpretive tradition that reads the Watcher narrative technologically, predating modern archaeology and the history of technology by centuries. And most broadly, the existence of CFA 7 and the manner in which it has been treated by institutional scholarship illustrates something important about how knowledge institutions manage evidence that challenges their established frameworks. The response to Morabito in 1934, to Berger in 1978, to Cantelmo in 2009 is consistent. Not refutation, silence. The document is acknowledged to exist, its physical authenticity is acknowledged, and then it is not engaged with. This is the operation of institutional incentives and disciplinary boundary maintenance that effectively suppresses inconvenient evidence without requiring any coordinated decision to do so. That pattern is visible across many domains of knowledge. Recognizing it in the specific case of CFA 7 is a way of understanding how it operates in general. The 200 names are there in the manuscript. They have been there since at least 1357, and probably much longer. They match the Book of Enoch verbatim and in sequence. The document that contains them has been physically authenticated. The scholarly engagement it deserves has not materialized. Those are the facts. The document exists. The names match. What you do with it is up to you. If you made it to the end of this, you are exactly the kind of person this channel is built for. The people who want the actual documents, the actual arguments, the actual evidence. Primary source analysis, institutional history. The questions that do not get asked in mainstream venues because they are too inconvenient to ask.